Hello everyone, today we're going to go over Standard 2. Standard 2 deals with some aspects of the early republic and moving into westward expansion and how the United States gains territory moving from the east coast to the west coast. So let's get started. Okay, so one of the earlier and one of the largest expansions is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. So this happened under President Thomas Jefferson. So in 1803, Jefferson purchased Louisiana from France. Okay, the French and British were at war at this time. Napoleon was Emperor of France and sold French assets in the Americas to the United States. So with this, he sent Lewis and Clark to explore the purchase, okay, which was a win, and their purpose was to find a northwest passage. Basically, an easier passage from the east to the west, to the Pacific Ocean. Okay, they did not find this. So this was a failure. But the overall purchase and adding this land to the United States was considered a win. So Jefferson had doubts as to whether the Constitution permitted the federal government to purchase land, but he did it anyway. This is important because if you remember from Standard 1, Jefferson was a Democratic Republican or a Jeffersonian Republican, and that meant that he had a strict interpretation or a strict construction of the Constitution, meaning he's supposed to follow it to the T, okay, and he believes others should as well. But he doesn't really do that here, even though the Constitution is unclear on whether or not the federal government has this authority, he does it anyway, okay? All right, so the War of 1812, we're just going to hit on this briefly. With the War of 1812, the U.S. is going to basically truly get its independence from Britain. It's kind of like the Revolution 2.0, where we fight England again. One of the things that leads up to that is going to be the Embargo Act of 1807. So like I said earlier, Britain and France are fighting each other. And while this is going on, the United States is trying to trade with both Britain and France. American ships are being stopped by British and French ships, and in some cases being attacked, their cargo being stolen. And in the case of British ships, U.S. seamen are being basically kidnapped, being taken, being impressed by the British, taken from their ships and forced into the British Navy to fight. And Thomas Jefferson, in trying to stop this, pushes Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. And what he's attempting to do with the Embargo Act is to prevent America, or basically cut off trade from America to Britain and France, to try to coerce or try to punish them and force them to stop doing these things against America, to stop violating American neutrality by not trading with them. It does not work. Okay, it's ineffective, and in fact, it really hurts America's economy more than it does the French or the British economy. So that's seen as quite the blunder on Jefferson's part. Okay, then comes James Madison. We get this declaration of war in 1812, and the things he cites are the impressment of U.S. sailors, like we talked about, cutting off American trade by taking cargo. And then the last thing is Britain actually arming Native Americans, okay? The British still had some territory in the Americas, Canada, but other areas as well. And as the U.S. is expanding westward, the British were arming Native American tribes to resist that expansion. So that was cited as one of the reasons why we declared war on Britain in 1812. So after the War of 1812, the U.S. continued to expand west, ushering in an era of democracy and the common man. Andrew Jackson All right, and this is really why we talk about the War of 1812 for our standards anyway. Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was elected president in 1828. Jackson typified this era of common man. Okay, so we also call this Jacksonian democracy, okay? Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was elected president in 1828. Jackson typified this era of the common man, also known as Jacksonian democracy. So all that means here is that more and more states are eliminating their property requirements for voting, okay? It's still male, it's still white males, but property requirements are being dropped. Okay, so while president, of course, one of the most infamous or notorious things Jackson does is, of course, his Indian Removal Act that he gets passed through Congress. So that initiates the Trail of Tears. Okay, the Trail of Tears. Jackson approved of moving Native American tribes, such as the Cherokee, from the southeast to the Indian Territory, which was Oklahoma. Jackson has spent much of his career, his military career, fighting Indians, okay? And of course, that's going to drastically change the way of life for the Cherokee and other tribes. It's going to lead to a lot of suffering, a lot of casualties along that route. Okay, so some other key territorial acquisitions for westward expansion that we covered this year. 1803, we've already talked about the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so if you guys ever think, Louisiana, why is it called Louisiana? Well, we got it from the French, right? King Louis, so that's where that comes from. And that's this area on the map here. You can see. Okay, so quite a big chunk, really doubled the size of the nation. 1845, we have the Texas annexation. All right, so we'll talk more about that in just a bit, but that's this area here. Texas is going to get its independence from Mexico and then be annexed by the U.S. 1846, we get the Oregon Treaty. That's going to be a treaty between us and Great Britain over this area right here, the Oregon Territory. And then 1848, we have the Mexican Cession. And that is the territory that Mexico is forced to give us after the Mexican-American War, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And that's right there. Okay? And that essentially gets us from the territory that we already got through the American Revolution, okay? Got us from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, westward expansion. Okay, continuing on with Standard 2 and westward expansion, 1823, we have the Monroe Doctrine, okay? So the Monroe Doctrine is an American policy that deals with Europe. And basically, the American government under President Monroe is telling Europe, no new colonies, okay? The Western Hemisphere, all right, you can see in this political cartoon here, the Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America, it is off limits to you guys. By this time, a lot of those colonies had won independence from places like Spain, from places like France, Portugal, and the United States was saying, you guys can't come back and try to take them back. You can't come over here to the Western Hemisphere, to the Americas, and try to build new colonies. We are the influencer over here, and this is going to be our neighborhood. This is our neighborhood now. Now, in reality, the Monroe Doctrine had little impact on European powers at the time, but it is significant for U.S. foreign policy because it provides justification for later U.S. presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, like Taft, like Wilson, to intervene in Latin America in the 20th century. So it doesn't really have a whole lot of teeth against Europe, but later it's going to be used as a precedent for future presidents in their dealings with Latin America and with Europe as well. Okay, so with westward expansion, the big idea, the big concept behind all of this is manifest destiny. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you take it literally, something that's manifested itself, something that is evident, something that's right there, it's obvious. Okay, here's some more. Apparent, plain, something that's right there in front of you. Okay, so destiny, what does that mean? Well, destiny is something that is predetermined, right? Predetermined, or something that is inevitable or irresistible. It cannot be changed. All right, it's your destiny. And what is this manifest destiny for the United States? Well, that manifest destiny, according to many Americans, was westward expansion. That westward expansion was the destiny of the United States, and it was a God-given right for America. Okay, that God had preordained or predestined the United States to control the territory from east, okay, the Atlantic, to west, the Pacific. And that's going to be the idea that fuels and justifies a lot of our territorial expansion, even at the expense of others. Okay, and part of that is going to be what happens with Texas and the Mexican-American War. So 1835 to 1848, Texas, a Mexican state, attracted many American colonists from the southern United States. In 1835, after disputes with the Mexican government about dictatorship and slavery, Texas declared independent. So a big part of that was the fact that a lot of these Southern Americans that are going into Texas are going there to grow cotton using the plantation system that was prevalent throughout the southern United States. So with that, they brought their slaves with them. And of course, having Mexico abolish slavery was not going to sit very well with them. They also had some issues with Santa Anna and the way he governed and his dissolution of the Constitution. Okay, so they declared independence, and they're going to fight for that independence against Mexico. So in 1836, Texas asked to be annexed as a U.S. state. At that time, the United States refuses. Okay, they refuse to take Texas on. And the reason for that is because there was a border dispute between Texas and Mexico. All right. And they knew that if they annexed Texas, then they would have a border dispute with Mexico, and that could potentially lead to conflict with Mexico. And at that time, that was something that they didn't want, okay? So a border dispute, that would lead to conflict with Mexico. And the second reason was the balance of power okay, the balance of power between states. And that balance of power centered around slavery, okay? So they didn't want to upset that balance of free state versus slave state, and Texas would come in as a slave state. Now, some things are going to change between then, 1836 and 1845. So 1844, the presidential campaign, Texas became an important issue. The annexation of Texas. There were a lot of Americans who were for it. And James K. Polk, okay, supported annexation, and he won that election. So in 1845, the U.S. annexes Texas. And that triggers, because of the border dispute, that triggers war with Mexico. Okay, we don't need to know a ton of details about that war. Just basically that it started over this border dispute because Texas had gained its independence from Mexico, and Mexico wasn't all that happy about that, obviously. And they really saw America as kind of meddling in their business when the United States annexes Texas. So that triggers the war with Mexico, and America wins. wins big. So 1848, we get the Mexican Cession. Okay, and this is part of the treaty that ends the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So from this, Mexico has to cede, they have to give, okay, that's what cession means. They have to give land to the United States because they lost the war. And it was a lot of land. So some of the states that were included in this land, we've got California, okay, also Nevada, Utah, and Arizona as well. Parts of these places. Okay? So the U.S. gets all of that land. So the United States and Mexico became adversaries as a result of this. So our relationship with Mexico will continue to be rocky really forever. And this was sort of the beginning of that. So meanwhile, the U.S. Compromised with Britain on the border of Oregon. So while we fought a war with Mexico to get the Mexican Cession, well, to get Texas and then the Mexican Cession out of it, with Britain, we were able to compromise and work out a treaty getting the Oregon Territory. Okay, moving on from westward expansion. Along with westward expansion, we are in the antebellum period, okay? So antebellum means before the Civil War. All right, so in U.S. history, antebellum describes the period from 1820 to 1860. Okay, so 1820 to 1860. Between the Missouri Compromise and the Civil War. All right, so in American history, antebellum means before the Civil War. The Latin root is just before the war, but in our context, it's before the Civil War. So 1820 to 1860, between the Missouri Compromise and the Civil War. So leading into this, throughout the antebellum period, we have the growth of sectionalism, okay? So sectionalism is just sort of the expansion of those big differences between the three colonial regions. And that has developed into really the North, the South, and the West, and how they are different from one another, okay? So the economy in the North has developed into one that is based on industry, right? Factory system, okay? Not slave labor, right? Lots of immigrant labor, but no use of slavery. The South, it has maintained this agricultural or agrarian economy that still relies on cash crops and uses slave labor through the plantation system. And the West, remember, this area is growing. People are settling there. People are moving there. It is developing an agricultural economy. All right. And depending on what part of the West you're in, depending on which state or territory, there may be slaves and there may not be slaves. So it just depends. So political leaders from these areas. In the North, Daniel Webster is going to be an influential guy. Okay, pro-industry. In the South, it's going to be a South Carolinian named John C. Calhoun. If you guys remember, he was Andrew Jackson's vice president. And then in the West, we've got a very charismatic, pragmatic guy named Henry Clay. He's a representative from Kentucky. Okay, so the political issues of each of the sections where, the things that they cared about the most. Well, for the North, it's going to be protective tariffs and protecting industries, so tariff. And they are going to be pro-tariff, pro-protective tariff, right? If you guys remember, we talked about protective tariffs earlier, and basically they're there to protect domestic industries, right? So basically the government is stepping in and putting a tax on buying goods from other countries. So what that does is it artificially increases the price of that good and makes Americans more likely to buy goods made in the United States because they are artificially cheaper because they don't have those same taxes on them, okay? And the North really likes this because, once again, they're an industrial-based economy. They're trying to make a lot of this stuff. They're competing with Europe, and these tariffs help them get more business, okay? So they're pro-tariff. Slavery is also a bit of a political issue, not as big as the tariff in the North, but we do have a growing abolitionist movement there. And of course, that movement is anti-slavery, okay? And generally speaking, the North, they are anti the spread or expansion of slavery into the Western territories because that would mean more, agriculturally based states and more states that would be anti-tariff, okay? So speaking of that, the South, we've got tariffs as a big issue there, except, of course, with their economy being the opposite of the North, they are against those tariffs, okay, anti-tariff, because it's making goods for them more expensive. It's also kind of, in some cases, straining some of their trade relations with other countries. They rely on other countries buying cotton from them, as well as the North buying cotton from them, but other countries as well. Okay, and another huge issue for the South is going to be slavery. And they are, of course, pro-slavery and pro the expansion of slavery. So they want slavery to spread through these Western territories. So they have more power and influence in Congress against things like protective tariffs and the expansion of slavery. In the West, they want whatever is going to help them continue to develop economically. So economic development is going to be their big issue. So whatever helps them do that, they're cool with. In some cases, that's going to be slavery. In some cases, that's going to be protective tariffs, okay? But they're more for economic development overall. So all of these differences are, of course, going to lead to conflict, and that conflict is eventually what's going to pull us into secession and civil war. Okay, so let's, for a minute, talk about some of the social and cultural characteristics of the antebellum period. We're going to see a lot of reform movements come through. So the Second Great Awakening, is I'm going to skip a box for a second, but just stay with me. Second Great Awakening is a religious revival, okay? Religious revival. So a lot more people going to church. Churches are really growing. New denominations are going to be formed. And a lot of this is centered around the Baptist faith, as well as the Methodist faith. All right? And you don't necessarily need to know a ton of figures from the Second Great Awakening. Just a few. Francis Asbury. All right, so he's a prominent Methodist, along with Richard Allen. And Richard Allen, he was the founder of the AME Methodist denomination. But overall, because of the Second Great Awakening, we see more people getting involved with church and religion, and that's also starting to spur people to start thinking about the culture around them and morality, and it starts sparking other reform movements like abolitionism, like temperance, like the women's rights movements. Okay, so moving on with those. Abolitionism, one of the biggest figures for us in the antebellum period is going to be William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, so if you guys remember on your golden ticket, he's the guy who publishes The Liberator, right? Big abolitionist newspaper, and his writings in his newspaper act as kind of like a hub for the abolitionist movement. Of course, there's lots of others. Harriet Tubman is going to be a big one, but it's all kind of surrounding that hub. Okay, so information, of course, abolitionism is anti-slavery. They are for not only are they against the expansion of slavery, but they are also for its abolition in the states that it's already in, so primarily in the South. Okay, the temperance movement, you don't need to know any key figures for that one. Some information about it. Temperance is just the anti-alcohol movement. Anti-alcohol. So that's for prohibition, right? So it gets its start in the mid-19th century, mid-1800s, and it's primarily going to be led by women. They're going to campaign against alcohol because of drunkenness and all of the evils that they claim it causes, joblessness, poverty, domestic abuse, all these different things. And eventually, come 1920s, they're going to see that happen, and we'll get prohibition of alcohol. All right, next, women's rights. So with women's rights, we're talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony as well. We'll just leave it here. Cady Stanton. Okay, and the biggest aspect for the women's rights movement was going to be, the vote. Suffrage for women, okay, the right to vote. Okay, so antebellum reform movements were strongest in the North. So there's kind of an addition to sectionalism, but did not catch on in the more traditionally minded South. The more aggressively Northerners criticized the institution of slavery, the more the South defended it. All right, so things are only going to get more heated as time goes by. All right, I hope this helps, guys, and I'll be back with Standard 3 later.